The second one I was really unfamiliar with. It's called Nightmare Alley, directed by Edmund Golding, and starred a fellow named Tyrone Power, who I could not believe was white. I had to ask my dad. I'm like, because he's like, yeah, so it started this guy, Tyrone Power, who was this really like up and coming actor at the time, because my dad's all into classic film. And I was like, sorry, was he white? Because that's like a black guy name. That really threw me for a loop. That guy needed to be black so bad. Also, Joan, I guess. Joan Blondell and Colleen Gray. This one's from 1947. Nightmare Alley was really cool. Nightmare Alley is also described as a noir film, which I would definitely describe it as. It has a dark atmosphere. Essentially, it opens in like a circus, in a traveling carnival freak show kind of thing that was very popular at the time. These roadside carnivals that would set up in town, and this was in the United States. And it would essentially be, before the internet, how are you going to see a really fat man? You'd have to go to the carnival. Like back then, that was like, oh my God, he's 300 pounds? It would be things like that. As well as, more I would call them the very kind of seedy. They tended to be a little bit, exploitative, especially of people who had disabilities. Like if someone had dwarfism, it would be like, look at it's a pixie and shit like that. Anyone with some kind of physical deformity or weird thing would, it's a freak show. But these also would often feature interesting presentations, I guess. So like themed shows and short stage plays. And the most important thing at the beginning of this, new age spiritual attractions, I guess I'd call it. Essentially, Tyrone Powers plays he's like, what does he do at the start? He's just like a carny hand. Like he just kind of helps around the carnival in general. And there is this woman she goes by Xena, and her whole deal is that she is supposedly like a psychic. So the act that she puts on is a bunch of people in the crowd write questions to her, and they collect all the questions and they put them underneath the thing. They put them like underneath the stage that she's on. And then, so what the act is that she's just sitting up there, and then she essentially starts, quote unquote, reading the questions, which she shouldn't be able to see, and then reading out like, oh, who said them, and what was the question, and then she would give some kind of answer about like, oh, will my daughter recover from her illness? And she would go, yes, she will make a full recovery. And they'd be like, wow, she could like psychically see the letter. She could see my question, so of course she must know what the future is going to be and stuff like that. And then you see the behind the scenes, which is that the stage they've got, there's like this little optical trick where they've got all the messages, and they just open them and they like put them through like a mirror, essentially, like this sort of mirror reflective thing, so she can look down, and while she's blindfolded, like look down through the blindfold and see through like only from where she's standing. There's like a little spot where it'll kind of be like projected to her. And that's, of course, how she reads them. It's a scam. It is an elaborate scam magic trick. That's like the basic one they do, but it starts to get, it gets more elaborate. Because she has this like assistant who is this like complete drunkard. This total drunkard who they have this secret code with each other. It's like a word code. It doesn't like really make sense. You're just like, okay. I guess it works. Essentially, so what they'll do, for instance, is she'll be blindfolded on the stage, and a bunch of people in the audience will have objects, and he will go up and he'll ask, like, what's this object? But the way that he asks the question, like, every word that he says is, like, translated through a code to mean something else. So it'll be like, can you describe what this object is? And that will mean, like, it's a pocket watch or something. And everyone goes, whoa! So Tyrone Powers is one night. So the atmosphere of the circus is fantastic. The set is it's tremendous. It looks great in black and white. It's dark. It feels like this. It feels kind of otherworldly because it's all just cars and big boxes and sets and stuff like that, and ropes and curtains everywhere, all just set up like, in the open air. And at night, it's just all these shadows and stuff. It looks awesome. So what ends up happening is Xena's assistant ends up drinking himself to death one night, which happens to be because of a bottle of alcohol, I think like Everclear, that the main character, I think his name is Stanley, I think. His name is Stanton Carlisle. So Stanton gives him like this bottle of Everclear. And then the next morning, because he feels bad for him, because like the guy he is such an alcoholic that he's gone like a couple hours without a drink, and he's like he starts going through withdrawals. So he gives him the bottle, and then the next morning they find him dead. And Stanton is like, and no one knows that it was him. Everyone just assumes like, oh, it's just, some bottle that he had. So what ends up happening is that Xena teaches him the code. She teaches him the code while he's kind of like falling in love with this performer who does this, like, it's like she supposedly gets electrocuted, but she survives, is her act. They're falling in love, and then this like kind of kerfuffle happens where the two of them, essentially there's like this kind of crisscross where each of them now has like a partner that they work with, and they're seeing each other. And Stanton and what's her name? Molly? Yeah, Molly. They, the partners that the people they work under, Xena and the guy who's part of like Molly's act, are like, stop, you're gonna like run away and get married. And they have this like fight. They get thrown out, and then Stanton is like, hey, now that we've been kicked out of the circus, why don't we just go solo? And thus begins this long kind of descent. It's this interesting story character arc where Stanton is essentially, he's this I really like watching characters like him. I just think that they're fun. Is he can talk himself out of anything. There's this whole scene where a police officer, like the local sheriff, he wants to shut the carnival down. And Stanton goes through this whole, like, thing where this whole routine, essentially. This almost practiced routine of supposedly reading the guy's mind and reading his past and his future. And it's just like that psychic scam trick where he goes like, oh, you had a dog growing up. And he's like, yes, I did. And it's like, yeah, because like every boy has a dog. And he essentially goes for things that sound specific, but in reality, they're so common and so broad that they could be applied to most everyone with just a simple, read on what kind of maybe upbringing they had. And he just completely goes through this whole almost like religious thing of where he's just talking to the sheriff about like, oh, you feel like underappreciated in certain ways. And he's like, yes, I do. And it's like, yeah, because everyone feels underappreciated in some way, or a lot of people do, right? And if you tell someone that, they're going to be like, yeah, I think I do. And he basically just he uses his silver tongue to just kind of like send him off and make him believe so much in what they're doing that it's legitimate, that he decides not to shut the carnival down. That's the kind of character he is. He is totally comfortable with lying. You get these sorts of peeks into his childhood where he mentions that he grew up in an orphanage that was very abusive and that they would get hit all the time. And he had to find ways to... He had to basically find ways to talk. He was so physically powerless as a child, he had to find ways to talk his way out of every situation. And that skill essentially parlayed into this kind of profession he has of being a carny and being able to sell people on things. And so it's this guy who has this ability, who feels like no matter what he can do, he can always get what he wants. He just, it doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter what he has to do. It doesn't matter how immoral it is. He believes completely in himself that he can pull it off if he just comes up with the right story, if he has the right approach, if he uses his intuition and his a little bit of guesswork, that he can do anything. And so now, like, he and Molly essentially start up this act again where he's now playing the role of the psychic and she's the assistant. And he is just blows up overnight. It's funny. This takes place in Chicago, which is funny. It actually takes place in the same universe as one of my favorite movies, Ordinary People, because it takes place in Chicago and there's therapists. So it's actually like a shared universe thing that most people aren't aware of. It's the Chicago therapy shared universe. I say that because he runs into this lady who is a therapist in like Highland Park or something, which was like, oh, like my dad and I both pointed at the screen. We're like, oh, oh, we know that place. Again, it is always really funny. Oh my god, like, okay, there's a point where a character says like, oh, don't worry, I belong to the Rogers Park Boat Club. And I was like, or no, the Rogers Park Beach Club. And I was like, whoa, that's where I grew up. I know the Rogers Park Beach Club. I don't know if it's like still a beach club, but they have these stupid private fucking beaches over there on the lake. What am I talking about? Anyway, yeah. It takes place in Chicago, which is funny. Actually, kind of a perfect setting, because Chicago is known as the Windy City. The reason is not because it's windy there, although it can get very windy in Chicago. It's because Chicago had it was infamous for having so many businessmen who were full of hot air, as it would be. As in, they would talk themselves up, or they would essentially... they were fraudsters of one degree or another. People who were all talk with nothing to back it up. And so, what better place for a con artist mentalist, as they say, a mentalist, than the city of hot air? So he runs into this psychologist who is doubtful of him. And she goes to one of his shows and she tries to trip him up. And she asks a question about something that isn't real. She asks, like, do you think my mother will recover from her illness? And he gets like some just weird sixth sense intuition. And he assumes that, and he says, the answer to that question is unorthodox, because I think that this person's mother died years ago. She's like, what the hell? So he goes to her office, and like, essentially it is as his success rises and his ambition rises, the levels to which he's willing to stoop drop further and further, because it's like this inch by inch thing where it's like, okay, at first he's just conning, like, these rich people and all that. And then it turns into, who are showing up to these fancy suit and tie events where he's like a big show, a big draw. And then it turns into like, he visits her office and he finds out that she actually records all of her therapy sessions, which are for her own notes, right? They're private. And they start conspiring to where people start asking him to do private sessions. And because she is like a really high profile psychologist, she gets clients from like all over like the high society. So she feeds him information about her clients and their private lives, and he uses that to then make his stories more believable when he does these like private sessions for them. And it starts to get really like, because it's like this man whose daughter died. No, his wife died. Actually, a lot of people who had family members who died, and Stanton starts knocking it up because he starts ratcheting up how far he's willing to go. Because now it's not just, I see that your daughter died. Now it's, I see her. She's in the room with us. And he puts on this big show where he like falls over. And then it progresses into like, he's going to put on, this guy wants to give him like a radio show, but he needs to be like 100% convinced, because he's like an atheist, he's a skeptic, and he needs to be convinced that Stanton can actually see his dead wife, the guy's dead wife, and he could even make her materialize for him. And Stanton's like, I can do that. And it's like, it's so messed up, right? Like, it's so exploitative and awful. It's so morally wrong. And while this is happening, so one of this really cool element of the plot is that Xena, who is like, the original psychic who started this off, she does have a genuine belief in the occult, and she's really into tarot cards. So he visits her in her trailer one morning, and she's doing tarot cards. And she pulls all of these cards, and one of them that she pulls is for her assistant, the drunkard guy. And this is before he dies. And there's like she pulls the death card, and then she's like, oh, that's pretty dark, that he's going to die at some point. He's like, well, I mean, he's not, his health isn't very great. I mean, and then as he's walking out, he goes, oh, you dropped one of the cards. And he picks it up, and she starts freaking out. She goes, was it face down or face up? Was it face down or face up? And he goes, it was face down when I picked it up. And she goes, that means that whatever is on this card is going to happen very soon. And she turns it over, and it's the Hanged Man. And he's like, oh, whatever. Like, okay, Xena, like, okay, whatever. Like, I know all of this is a scam. He's like, oh yeah, okay, whatever. You're buying into your own BS, essentially. You're so deep in it at this point. And then the guy dies for real. And he's like, but he can still kind of chalk it up to just like, oh, it was just an accident. It was just random chance. This happened to be the night, when he and his Molly, who are now they're married. Now that they're doing this act on their own, Xena and one of the other guys from the circus come to visit them. And they decide, like, okay, let's patch things up and we can be civil and let bygones be bygones. And Xena, he comes back into the room, and Xena's doing tarot. And she's pulling the tarot cards for him. And they get into like some argument, because Xena imagines, she says, like, she gives him this essentially fortune that is, this card means that if you choose to do this, like make a change in your business, bad things are going to happen, is what she tells him. And he gets really mad, and he looks at Molly, and he's like, why did you tell her that? Why'd you tell her that I had this deal with the radio guy? And she's like, I didn't tell her anything. So they get into this big argument. Xena and the other circus guy storm out, but Xena comes back in because she forgot her tarot cards, and she realizes there was one on the ground. And it was face down, and it's the Hanged Man. And Stanton is like, you can tell he's like, that's bullshit. Get the fuck out of here. I just shut up. Shut up with your weird occult witch bullshit. And she leaves, and he's just, you can tell he's so freaked out. He is so freaked out because things have just kind of been getting, while he's, again, as he's more and more successful, he's more and more like ethically compromised. And so he kind of starts, he really starts spiraling as things, because stuff starts to fall apart for him in these very dramatic ways. And he kind of hits this point where there's this, the last bit of the movie is really interesting because he hits this point where he starts to question whether or not he's like insane and whether or not he's just imagining things. Like he goes to he's trying to leave town. He's trying to skip town, and he goes to the psychologist, and he gets like a bunch of money that he stashed with her. He takes a bunch of money. He leaves. He realizes that instead of being like hundreds, all the bills are ones, and he goes right back to her. He climbs in like her window through the fire escape, and he's like, "Those were all ones." And she's like, "What are you talking about?" And he hears a siren, and he's like, "You called the police on me. You called the police," because she like took a moment to get dressed in her room. He like walks out. She's in her room, still getting dressed. And he's like, well, you were in there. You called the cops on me. She's like, what are you talking about? There's no siren. I didn't call the cops. And you can hear the siren. And so you're like, is she lying to him? Is she legitimately trying to gaslight? That's the actual textbook gaslighting. Is she lying to him to make him think he's insane, to like cover up her involvement in the scams? Is he really losing his mind? Who knows? And things just get worse and worse and worse. And he's in this hotel room. He's all by himself. He's freaking out. He doesn't know if he's going insane. And he's like, you know what would go really well right now? If I got super drunk. I don't want to spoil like where the movie ends up, but it's this. I really enjoyed it. I really like the characters and the progression of as he becomes this progressively more like unethical guy. This whole thing of like he's been lying his whole life, you know. So much of his life is being consumed by lies that he's told that now he like almost doesn't even know fact from fiction and what he made up and what someone else made up. And there's so many stories and everything. Really fun, really cool movie. I dug it a lot. The last bit is like, oh shit, the last like 10-15 minutes are fascinating in how hard they drive the theme of the film through. It was really interesting.